Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. This is your host, Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian and education program manager for the Taylor Hooten Foundation. Are you someone that's trying to figure out a way to get better sleep? And have you tried any type of remedies to improve your sleeping habits? We know sleep is such a critical piece to our overall health and wellness, as well as for those looking to optimize their athletic performance. Millions of people globally have tried numerous methods to improve their sleep, whether it's through better sleep hygiene, a dietary supplement, or a prescription-based drug. How much do you sleep each night and how much do you need? And can impaired sleeping habits increase your chances of gaining weight? Can a consistent pattern of insufficient sleep negatively impact your health? In this episode, I'll be speaking with sleep expert Dr. Meeta Singh, who has worked with a variety of professional teams from the World Series champion Washington Nationals to the Detroit Lions, Detroit Red Wings, Detroit Tigers, Detroit Pistons, and the New Orleans Saints to help their athletes improve their sleeping patterns. We'll dive deep into the benefits of getting adequate sleep, how a lack of sleep impacts your health, sleep hygiene, and whether or not there are any dietary supplements that can improve your sleeping habits. And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Meeta Singh to the All Me podcast. Dr. Singh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's
such an honor to have you. I know we've had a chance to speak at a conference in the past, and I was just fascinated with a lot of your work, especially around the world of sleep, because we know this is a big area where a lot of people struggle. So I'm excited. I was able to watch your presentation, but there's a lot more information that I didn't absorb that I'm going to absorb today. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
No problem. So let's dig right into this. First of all, let's talk about your career path first. Why did you want to become a physician?
Well, Tavis, I'd like to say it was something really brilliant, but I was a bit of a nerd while I was growing up. You know, I loved books. I was drawn to stories about doctors helping people, and so I applied for medical school, and that's really it.
Yeah, it sounds like me. I thought I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up. I had this vision of wanting to be a pediatrician. And all of a sudden, when I got to LSU, it was like, all right, I just had way too much fun, and partying and medicine didn't really combine. And you can't get off on a bad foot. And when you start out with a 1.8 GPA, it takes forever to recover. So I was like, I got to figure out what I want to do with my life. Unfortunately, I didn't get that, but I got here. I guess my next question then is, you wanted to be a doctor, but how did you get into the part where, when you choose that specialty, doctors like, what do I want to do? How did you go into sleep medicine?
I was doing my final year of a psychiatry residency at Mayo Clinic. And one of the elective months we can choose what we want to rotate it and do our rotations in. And I did sleep medicine, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And so I've been a sleep specialist since then.
Yeah, and it seems like we need, so many people struggle with this, and kind of leads to my next question. We know adequate sleep is so important. But before we really start discussing the benefits, let's talk about the data and the research. What percentage of people don't get adequate sleep?
So I guess, we must begin with what is adequate sleep. So while sleep requirements vary slightly from person to person, most healthy adults, we need between 7 to 9 hours of sleep to function at our best. And teenagers and children need even more. And I know that, there is this thought that your sleep need actually decreases with with age, but most older people still need about 7 hours of sleep. And one definitely starts to see deficits in mental and physical performance, as well as detrimental effects on physical and mental health if you get less than 8 hours. And, according to the CDC, the latest report was that about a third of the people, so about 1/3 of Americans don't get the required amount of sleep.
So how important is adequate sleep to helping someone control their weight?
Good question. I would say it plays a key role, and as sleep does in almost all other health-related issues. And we are learning more and more about its role with obesity. So Firstly, poor sleep has repeatedly been linked to a higher BMI and weight gain. So, these are studies, these are either observational or prospective studies, and they show short sleep duration significantly increases risk of obesity, both in children as well as adults, right? And now there's also studies that show that weight gain is seen when there is experimental reduction in sleep. And so that's the first finding that we know. Secondly, studies show that poor sleep can cause insulin resistance, which is a precursor to both weight gain and type 2 diabetes. Now, so for your audience, insulin is a hormone that moves sugar from the bloodstream into your body cells so that we can use it as energy. And if your cells become insulin resistant, there's more sugar that remains in your bloodstream. And as a result, your body now starts producing more insulin. And so essentially, when you get less sleep, there is a reduction in the ability of insulin to clear glucose. And glucose metabolism itself becomes impaired.
Yeah, no, that's important to know, because I think a lot of people talk just about a lot of the benefits when it comes to food control and insulin reduction and glycemic index. So it's so important and really interesting to hear about how sleep regulates hormonal patterns. And that's kind of, one of my questions when it comes to looking at hormones like ghrelin and leptin. They might be able to regulate our hunger and fullness levels. I've seen where if we don't get enough sleep, it might increase our desire to eat. Is this true? And can you explain in more detail?
Yes. This is a very interesting finding. So leptin, so there are two main hormones that are involved. Leptin is a hormone that your fat secretes. It tells your brain that you're full. So it regulates your appetite, and it helps you tolerate that 8-hour long fast you have while you're asleep. So leptin is high when you're sleeping. And if you're sleep deprived, there's reduced leptin levels. And as a result, you're more hungry. The second hormone is ghrelin, and it's basically the exact opposite of leptin. It tells your brain when you need to eat, so it's a hunger hormone. And while you're asleep, the levels of ghrelin normally should be decreased, and if you're sleep deprived, you have more ghrelin that makes you hungrier. I always tell people, so it's this concert that these two hormones have was probably evolution's way of protecting hunters and gatherers, our ancestors, because if you were not sleeping, you were in danger, and so you consumed more calories to store to use later. Unfortunately, of course, the hunting we do now when we don't sleep is when we wake up and make our trip to the refrigerator. Sleep regulates your hunger levels. Now, the other thing, the one additional thing that lack of sleep does is it raises the blood level of a lipid called endocannabinoid, which basically it acts on your brain like marijuana would. It makes the act of eating more enjoyable, especially in the evening. And so you now crave fatty, carbohydrate-rich food, and you tend to eat more. So you're craving food, you're not craving fruits and vegetables. And think about it, Tavis, when you're not sleeping less simply gives you more hours of the day to eat.
That's interesting to really think about that. I don't think if people really think about that, if they don't get enough sleep, let's say I get 5 hours, well, then I'm up 19 hours, then I'm craving more food. There's a chance that I'm going to want to eat a little bit more because I didn't get enough sleep. Is this true?
Yes, this is absolutely true. So I don't know if you know Sachin Panda. He's out of I want to say in San Diego. He's a circadian scientist, and he always talks about how when human beings are awake, our mouths are open. Basically, as long as we're awake, we're eating. We snack. That itself results in increased calorie intake. I mean, when you're asleep, you're fasting. And so if you get your 8 hours in bed, that's at least 8 hours when you're not eating.
Interesting. No, that is really interesting. So for our listeners, this is something to keep thinking about, because we focus so much on adequate sleep and we don't really think about that, because so many people are trying to lose weight and trying to get 70% of our countries trying to figure out how to lose weight and eat better. And they're probably not thinking sleep could be a pretty key. If they just focus on habits of sleep, that could shift to help them do that. That's really interesting and
right.
fascinating.
Well, one last thing I'll say here, just, something that you said just brought this thought to my mind. So in the last 100 years, in the Western world, the number of hours that we sleep has reduced, and it's progressively has reduced. And at the same time, we've gained weight. And so there's a correlation there.
Interesting.
And of course, now we have studies that show that there is actually a relationship.
Fascinating stuff. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more research as we continue to develop and learn more about this. Let's shift a little bit now to the world of athletic performance, because I know you work with professional sports teams to help their athletes with specific strategies to improving sleeping patterns, especially with on the road. But first question really is, how does sleep impact an athlete's performance?
Well, this sounds like a catchy phrase, but it's absolutely true that sleep is that one single switch circuit board that if it's off, it affects every aspect of athletic performance. So, how does poor sleep affect athletes? Let's count the ways. Whether it's your reaction time, so less sleep or poor sleep will make you slower, less accurate. It affects your decision-making capabilities. It contributes to errors. It contributes to the number of fouls that you can get, which are because of human error. It results in decreased amount of growth hormone, decreases the amount of testosterone. It impairs how your body metabolizes glucose. We just talked about that. And nutrition is an important part of athletic performance. Because lack of sleep makes you less accurate, it makes you slower, it increases your risk-taking behavior, so it increases the chances of you developing injuries. And in fact, it increases mood disturbances. At maximal effort, number one, it increases perceived effort. It reduces time to exhaustion, and it increases task failure at maximal effort. So in fact, every aspect of both physical and mental performance is affected by poor sleep.
So what you're telling me is, if you're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis, regardless of how good you are as an athlete, you're probably not going to perform well unless you're just a genetic freak.
I will say that most athletes in today's world, to be, a top elite athlete, you have to have this unique, innate cognitive as well as physical abilities. They are genetic freaks, right? And so, I'll give you an example. No amount of sleep is going to make me a football player. However, competition between, elite athletes now, both teams typically, or both opponents are so equally good that they're always looking for that one competitive edge, and sleep is one of them. So then when for example, let's talk about the World Series that just happened. During the World Series, both opposing teams were equally good, and it was a hard-fought series, right? Then after Game 5, the fact that the Astros got on a plane, went back to Houston, while the Nationals stayed and they spent an extra night and slept a full night and then left the next day, then things like that can make a difference.
Yeah, I don't think fans think about that. They're all riled up and ready for the next game. And I guess maybe only certain people that look at the analytics or really dig into see, who has the advantage? How does this affect certain things? And it's really
right. Well, yes. Well, I was going to say that, I always tell fans that because from the outside, it looks so glamorous. But you just see the athlete for 2 or 3 hours when they're on the field, or on the court on TV. But it's everything they've done the rest of the 24 hours, the 23 hours that they've done to prepare themselves to get on to the field. And sleep is a very important, it's about a third of their day. That is why maximizing and optimizing sleep will optimize performance and health for athletes.
Yeah. I was fortunate to be involved as a sports dietitian for a professional team for 8 years as a consultant, and just seeing what these athletes go through. I know people complain, you make a lot of money, and it's true, they make a lot of money, but it's a job just like anything else. They have to get to meetings in the morning, they go to practice, they have to eat, they go more and more meetings, and then they usually don't get home till late at night. And by that time, it's like their body goes through so much in process and it gets beat up throughout the season. So it's important to, and sometimes sleep and nutrition kind of get that neglect. They don't really think about that as much, or at least we don't.
Right.
All right. So.
Right. Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was like, I know it's hard to kind of measure performance outcomes, in practical settings outside of a lab, but have there really been any studies to look at the effects of sleep duration on performance outcome measures?
Well, yes. So the first thing is there is a lot of evidence that suggests that increasing sleep duration and improving sleep quality in athletes is associated with improved performance and competitive success. And, there were studies done in student athletes at Stanford. Bill Dement and Cherry Ma they did these studies, and basically these are really elegant and simple studies. They made athletes spend 10 hours in bed for about 6 weeks and found that not only did their performance measures improve, and these performance measures, by the way, were specific to the sport. So in basketball players, it was basketball performance measures. In football, tennis swimmers. So there was improvement in their performance, and the athletes were more energetic, they were less grumpy, and they were more alert going about their normal lives. And of course, remember, better sleep reduces the risk of both injury and illnesses in athletes. So when you optimize, you're not just optimizing their health when we are working with athletes when we are trying to optimize their sleep, but we're also potentially enhancing performance through increased participation in training, because they're well enough to actually train.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of studies out there that show, and I think that teams, both collegiate as well as professional teams, are now more and more aware of this.
Good. Yeah, and young athletes, if you're listening, or all athletes, I mean, sleep is so critical, as Dr. Singh has mentioned. We're going to talk about shortly, as we get through the questions, more about, what are the benefits and also how do we get that. But before we do, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit, but one question I wanted to know, and when I was kind of thinking, what are the questions I'm going to ask is, a lot of people, the work we do at our organization is a lot, obviously, on the steroids and anabolic hormones when people are using these things. But how does sleep affect hormonal balance, especially for an athlete trying to build muscle? How does it impact our anabolic hormones like testosterone, growth hormone, et cetera?
That is a very good question, and I want your athletes to pay attention. So first of all, growth hormone, which is essential for muscle growth for athletes, is only secreted during your deep sleep. The second thing is testosterone, which is key for muscle recovery and muscle health and a sense of vigor, and even the little amount of aggressiveness that you need when you're on the court. So testosterone is secreted during the day, but the amount of sleep you get will affect how much testosterone is secreted. And so there's a study that found that in just a week of getting 5 hours in bed instead of their recommended 7 to 9 hours, testosterone reduced in healthy young men as if they had aged 10 years or 11 years, 10 to 11 years. So so that means for a 20-year-old player, that would mean testosterone levels of somebody who is 31. And no player wants that. You want your testosterone levels to be higher. Really, sleep, when you're sleep deprived, hormones that build muscle, like testosterone, like a growth hormone, etc., reduce, and at the same time, hormones that break down muscle increase. And so the best natural way of making sure that you have the balanced hormonal makeup is to make sure you get enough time in bed. So cortisol levels and other steroids in your body, they have a circadian rhythm. So there's a certain time during the day that they peak, and a certain time when they're reduced. And athletes get sleep deprived, and if they have varying sleep times, what happens is that we throw those rhythm out of sync, and that can affect the levels too. You want hormones in a pill? Use sleep as a pill, is what I would say.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about recovery for athletes, and there's so many different things that make up recovery, whether it's an athlete wants to be less sore, we need to put more carbs and protein in their gas tank to help them recover. But, people don't think this is an important component of the recovery process. If you're constantly training and you're not getting enough sleep and you're not fueling well, then this is going to impact your hormonal balance, as you mentioned, and probably not only increase the chronological age, but it's also going to impact the way you perform.
Tavis, one thing we didn't mention is that sleep deprivation increases inflammation. Like, for example, I will tell pitchers that it is as important to sleep as it is to ice that arm after you've pitched. You need sleep because that is a natural way of reducing inflammation.
Yeah, and that's an important topic, because on the nutrition side, I love working with pitchers, and with my major league guys. With my major league guys, it's omega-3, it's turmeric, it's things that have that. So that combined with sleep, it's like, hey, make sure you do these things.
Right.
That's an incredible piece. So I appreciate you kind of touching on the inflammation side, because that's a big question. Now, the last kind of question from the athletic performance side is, A lot of cross-country travel. These guys are moving from place to place, and you might have a team that they're in the Nationals are playing in Washington, and the next week or the next day, they have to get on a plane and go to Los Angeles. How do you work with teams to make sure, whether it's local travel or international travel, to help them stay in a rhythm to get adequate sleep?
Let me start by giving you just a brief background for your audience. Circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are intrinsic timekeeping clocks that we have in us that regulate almost all physiological function on a daily basis. And so for human beings, our master circadian clock is located in the brain, and it's synchronized to the local environment by exposure to light and dark. So, think of light as an alertness pill, and think of dark as a signal to your brain to secrete melatonin, which strengthens sleep physiology. Now, when you take a jet and you rapidly cross time zones, your circadian rhythms will lag behind. And when they get to the new time zone, they're scrambling to get synchronized to the new local time zone as rapidly as possible. And that's what causes that difficulty in sleeping or staying alert during the new time zone. So that is the definition, a simple definition of jet lag. And of course, like you said, athletes travel frequently and they compete immediately after travel. So some of the focus of the work that I do with athletes and teams is to come up with a plan. And this is complex work. Working on picking their flight times, using strategic light exposure and avoidance, because light is the strongest way that you can shift your clock to adjust to the new time zone as quickly as possible, and scheduling their sleep time and their bedtimes and their wake-up times. So the goal is to help shift their circadian rhythms with the aim of optimizing performance.
Now we're kind of getting into those key pieces and those next questions. We focused a lot on athletes, and the listener who is not performing in competitive sports probably wants to know some of the answers to some of these next questions. So shifting our strategies now to just kind of get a better night's sleep. What are some of the key habits we can practice to ensure we sleep better? I think you've mentioned about, we're going to talk about what to avoid, but what are just some habits we can practice to ensure we get a good night's sleep?
The first thing I would do is I would say that we need exposure to bright light, so daily sunlight or artificial bright light during the day, and we need darkness at night, because that is what strengthens our circadian rhythms. We're now living in a society where there's light all the time. Right? I mean, at night, you can even carry a phone in your hand when you go to bed. That, I would say, it would be the first key habit, is to make sure that you get enough exposure to bright light during the day, and you have access to darkness at night, which would also mean minimal electronic use at night. The second, I would say, is to try to get a regular sleep-wake cycle, especially during the weekends. And, I understand a lot of us in America, we are sleep deprived, so we get less sleep during the week. So on the weekend, you want to play catch up, but you really don't want to change the timing very much. So, don't go to bed more than an hour, and don't sleep in by more than an hour. And if you still have to play catch up, take a nap in the mid-afternoon. And the third main point I would say is that avoid caffeine and alcohol too close to your bedtime. So 3 points. One is exposure to bright light and darkness at night. Number 2 is to be as regular as possible with your sleep-wake cycle. And number 3 is reduce the amount of caffeine and alcohol too close to your bedtime.
Now, the opposite, a lot of people have trouble going to sleep. I mean, one thing that's easy for me, I can go to sleep pretty quickly, but sometimes I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and then I can go back to sleep, which I hate. But a lot of people I know, they just struggle. They have so much struggle, whether it's anxiety, insomnia, to go to sleep. And I'm sure there are some external factors that cause this, whether it's TV, iPad. So let's dig into what are habits that people should avoid or prevent or reduce that could reduce their chances of falling asleep on time.
Well, so some of them we've already discussed. So, for example, don't drink caffeine too close to your bedtimes. The half-life of caffeine is about 5 to 6 hours, which you are an expert at. And of course, there's genetic variability. So some people, it might last longer and some shorter. So you don't want to drink caffeine, and you want to avoid nicotine too close to your bedtime, number 1. Number 2 is, I would say, using electronics. There is a blue-green light that your electronics emit at night. they actively suppress melatonin, which is the hormone that signals your brain that you're ready to sleep. So you want to avoid electronic use. The other thing, of course, also establish that electronics, they're interactive. It's a rabbit hole. Once you start going, if you start checking your email and then go on social media, so it's a rabbit hole that you can go down and you can lose track of time. And so I would say the great emphasis is in developing a winding down routine, and lots of people don't have that. And a good wind down routine should be at least 30 to 15 minutes. It should could be a hot bath, could be stretching exercises, it could be meditation or prayer time, and it could be reading a book, not on an electronic device, maybe listening to a podcast. Maybe not as one that is as interesting as yours. Those are things that people can do to help them wind down. Sometimes people are on the go the entire day. And so when they're on the go, things are still weighing on their mind. And so they get into bed, and that's the first time they have to process all the information, all the stuff that's been happening throughout the day, and that's the anxiety you were alluding to. And so maybe build an earlier a routine earlier during the day in which they are a worry time, a journal in which they sit down and they sort of brainstorm, so they don't have to think about it only once they get into bed.
Now, if I recall correctly, I thought I heard you say or mention about a certain temperature in the house that helps you kind of cool down.
Yes.
What should that be?
Okay, so this may not make me very popular, but really the temperature should be between 65 to 67 degrees. Remember that circadian clock we were just talking about?
Yes.
So your circadian, your body temperature has a circadian rhythm, and it starts to fall. And when it starts to fall, that signals your brain that you're ready to sleep. And therefore, the suggestion is that the bedroom should be cold. It should be dark, so cold and dark like a cave. And remember, caves don't have electronics. So it should be, and that's what helps sleep. Yeah, between 65 to 67 degrees.
I'm laughing because I'm sure people are going to be listening to this and they're going to go back to their spouse and go, we need to turn the air down to 65. And the other spouse is going to be like, whether it's the husband or wife, they're going to be like, they love to sleep when it's 72 or 73. And the other person's, always used to have that battle. So and I like to sleep.
Yes.
I love that. When I heard you say that, I was like, boom, 68, 67, here we go.
I have a solution. So my suggestion is to reduce the temperature in the room and yet have heavy covers, because if you have heavy covers, you can use them if you're cold, and then you can throw them off if you get hot. But really, the room temperature ideally should be cold.
Yeah. All right. Really important. So, because I know I get a lot of questions about supplements for sleep. Hey, what can I take? I see a lot of people post, hey, I can't sleep, what can I take? And especially, obviously, melatonin's popular, which we're gonna get into that separately. But besides melatonin, are there any other popular supplements that actually have evidence to support and help them maybe sleep a little better?
Okay, so the two supplements that I would prescribe would be magnesium and tart cherry juice. And they both have shown, there is research that shows that they help. Magnesium, the tart cherry juice is, it increases the amount of melatonin, and of course you still want to do everything else right too. You want to make sure you're getting to bed at your biological bedtime. You want the bedroom cold. You want it to be dark. You don't want to be doing the electronics. But those two supplements is what I would suggest.
Yeah, I've recommended magnesium specifically in the bisglycinate form, which has a higher absorption and higher bioavailability rate, because there's so many versions of magnesium. You want to avoid things like oxide because it's got poor bioavailability, but that's what we're going to see in most of our supplements. So I'm so glad you mentioned the tart cherry juice, because I have personally used that when I heard you say that before, and I was like, wow, this really does help me. But it's also an incredible natural anti-inflammatory, and most of our professionals, they keep it in their lockers or in their refrigerators in the fueling stations, because a lot of these athletes are using this after their workouts as well.
Right, and it has to be also, which I again, this is a subject you're actually an expert on, but tart cherry juice, otherwise it has to be in the form of a juice, And because otherwise you'd have to eat like, I don't know, a pound of cherries for the same effect. So, I'm sure that there's some very good brands out there that that are NSF certified for players and athletes to use.
Now, what should people avoid? What are some things you see people taking that they really should avoid because there's no evidence to support using it?
Okay, so now again, this is going to make me unpopular, but firstly, adults often turn to over-the-counter sleep aids, and most of them contain Benadryl or diphenhydramine. Or see, the thing is that is indicated only for very occasional difficulty in sleep and not for chronic use. And I would also, Benadryl and these sleep aids, they actually interfere with, they have significant side effects in older people. The other thing is the ones that you've probably heard of: valerian, tryptophan,
Yep.
kava. In general, chamomile tea. I hate to say it. In general, evidence to support their use is really lacking, and so, and I'm not sure that the question about their safety, especially when they're used chronically, has been addressed. Occasional use is different, but I know a lot of people talk about chamomile tea, and I think it's placebo effect, because I have never found a study that suggests that it actually works. But if it's benign, I say go for it, except that it might make you get up to go pee in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that could be a problem. You mentioned Benadryl, just real quick. I've known some parents that I've talked to that, for their kids, they're like, hey, my child really has trouble going to sleep, so they give them a Benadryl. Now, I just heard you say, hey, there's some side effects long term from this, but what about kids? How would we handle that? Like, what are the risks there?
Well, so I will say, Tavis, that the one population that I always say should be taken to a primary care doctor if they have sleep issues is a child. And the reason because insomnia in children is such a complex disorder. It could in fact oftentimes it's not a disorder of the kids at all. It has everything to do with parents and what they're doing. And because if children develop insomnia and this is left untreated, then they're going to turn into adults who have insomnia. So whenever a child is having problems with insomnia, then that child should definitely be taken to their primary care doctor or to a sleep specialist. Okay, the other thing is, of course, I don't know if you've heard of it, but Benadryl sometimes will not work at all. In fact, it does exactly the opposite, in which it makes a child more irritable, hyperactive, and so there's that. But in general, Benadryl will do things like it will cause constipation. It can cause urinary retention. It can cause difficulty in thinking. So it has anticholinergic effects, and you don't want that either in a child or in an an older adult.
Yeah, I'm anti-pharmaceutical as much as possible, so I definitely don't want to give my child anything unless it's really needed.
Yes.
So it's good to hear.
And that's, again, if I might just, I like what you just said, because the first line treatment for insomnia is actually behavioral. It is not medication. And so it is important for children and actually all adults, if they're having, insomnia symptoms that last over 30 days or 3 months, and it's impairing their day-to-day function, they need to seek help. Now, an occasional poor night here or there, I would say totally ignore it. Because if you pay attention to it, you're more likely to give yourself performance anxiety about sleep and make it worse.
Absolutely. Now, let's dig into melatonin. This seems to be the solves all the problem supplement when people can't sleep. But first of all, what is it and does it actually work?
Remember, we talked about the circadian rhythms. So melatonin is a hormone that your brain produces in response to darkness. And it really helps with the timing of your circadian rhythms. And it sends a signal to your brain that you're ready to sleep. And of course, if you're exposed to bright light, then your brain doesn't secrete that melatonin. Now, melatonin dietary supplements can be made either from animals or from microorganisms, but mostly they're synthetic. And the only true indications for melatonin would be if you were trying to fall asleep at a time that was not your biological bedtime. So in case of jet lag, if you have something called delayed sleep phase syndrome, which is basically, you're a night owl and you want to go to bed earlier. Some sleep disorders in children, and, anxiety before and after surgery. And after sports concussion, you can use melatonin. And in fact, insomnia, I was looking at the practice guidelines before our podcast, and in fact, the practice guidelines by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine says there's not enough strong evidence for the effectiveness or the safety of melatonin for chronic insomnia.
That leads to my next question. I look at countries like the UK, Japan, Australia, Canada. They've banned melatonin over the counter. So are there any specific risks like we should, be concerned about? Should children use melatonin?
Well, so short-term use of melatonin supplements appears to be safe largely, but it's, the problem is that we don't have information on long-term safety of supplementing it. And you and I know people are using it long term because they pop us a melatonin almost on a nightly basis, and they can do that for years. The problem, Tavis, is that melatonin is not FDA regulated, and because it's a supplement, and again, I know you're an expert at this because I remember from listening to your talk, we don't know what additives go into this.
Yeah.
I don't know, and it's the additives that might have side effects. So I will tell you that my suggestion is that if you're pregnant or you're lactating or if you're older or if you have any sort of heart, liver or kidney disease, don't use melatonin. Then you want to go ask a physician. And for children, I think because sometimes we do prescribe melatonin for children. Again, the practice parameters tell us not to. Again, one has to be very careful because we don't know the source. There's no way to tell that it contains what it says it contains.
Yeah. We've seen data from, and I tell people never buy supplements from a drugstore, from a typical retail store, just because of the data, but also none of these products are tested. There's no.
Right. I mean, I remember from the talk you gave, you were talking about just supplement. I mean, some of those pictures you showed us were pretty scary looking.
It is.
Because there was no way to see how they were actually being manufactured.
Yeah, well, there is some regulation. The FDA can't do enough, and it's 50,000 products on the market. It's impossible. Now, let's really kind of let's close out with really the benefits. I think I asked earlier what percentage of people don't get adequate sleep, and I'm like, wait a minute, that should have been one of my last questions. So let's talk about that, but also what are the key health benefits from getting adequate sleep? What are really the outcomes we get when we sleep better?
Like I said, about a third of the people don't get enough sleep. And some of the key benefits are, think about the organ system and it's benefiting. So there's reduced risk of heart disease, of stroke, reduced risk of cardiometabolic disease, reduced risk of mental illness. So, all mental health and sleep health are so closely intertwined. There's increased immune function. There's reduced infection if you don't get enough sleep. So it increases immunity. There's increased mental acuity, improves emotional regulation. I mean, every aspect of your health improves when you get adequate sleep.
Yeah, and I mean, that kind of ties into my last question. Are we at increased risk for specific disease if we don't get enough? And you mentioned it, stroke, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, all these things kind of intertwine and link together. So, I mean, these are all important things, and it's so important and critical that I think it's the one thing we neglect. And I hear a lot of people, I've even said, I'll get enough sleep when I die. But it's like, well, wait, I don't want to get there any sooner.
Well, hold on. So I like that. I want to, continue in continuation of, in response to the people who say, I will sleep when I'm dead. I tell them, well, I've got news for you. You're going to die sooner. So think of the three main ways that people get disease and die. It's either atherosclerosis, which is heart disease or stroke. It's neurodegeneration or dementia, or it's cancer. And then think of the unnatural causes of death, which is either car accidents or suicide. And not getting enough sleep directly and indirectly contributes to all of these pathways to death.
Interesting. Well, Dr. Singh, I want to go to just 3 curveball questions before we close out. These are questions. Now, listeners, these are questions Dr. Singh has no idea what I'm going to ask her because, we always kind of provide our guests with some questions so they can prepare. But these are questions she doesn't really know what's coming. So 3 questions. Now, 2 of these are going to be just some general questions not related to today's topic. First is, what is one thing our listeners will not know about you that they may find quite unique or interesting?
Okay. Well, I really like to knit. And I like to paint. I really like to knit, and I actually take my knitting with me every time I travel. And so I have, my husband teases me, I have these grandmotherly habits. So if even when I'm on a plane flying to see a Major League Baseball team or flying to see an NFL team, I always carry my knitting with me.
It sounds like it's stress relief. For me, it's, I play
It
guitar.
is.
I play guitar. I play music. I used to sing in a rock band. We did cover songs a long time ago. And my daughter and I are actually heading to open mic night tonight to play music. So
Nice.
I love it. Those little things are just so cool. And that's always a question I like to ask. Now, next question. What is your favorite city in the United States that you visited?
That I've visited or have lived in?
Or either one. What's your favorite city in the United States? If you had to say
I have to say, I love living in Detroit, Michigan. I really do. And I have to give you a little background because, I did not grow up here. And so when I finished my residency at Mayo Clinic, which was in Rochester, Minnesota, I said I was going to move to Detroit, Michigan because my husband's born and raised from here. And people say, well, that's like moving to the armpit of America. And it is so not. But the best part of it is, the revival that happened in the last 10 years. I mean, I would invite all your listeners to come to downtown Detroit. It is happening. And I bet you there'll be plenty of open mics for you guys, for you and your daughter to come sing here.
I agree. I've been to Detroit a couple of times for our program that we've had with the Tigers. And, I was completely blown away because everything I've heard growing up and in the past was like, oh, this is an awful place. And I get there and I'm like, wow, this is a beautiful place. Everything is centrally located. You can walk around. All of your major sporting stadiums are right within walking distance. Mm-hmm. It really reminds me a little bit of downtown New Orleans. A lot of culture, great food, great people.
Yes.
All right, last question.
Yes.
Related to the topic we discussed, but out of all the tips we discussed today, what is the one that you would tell someone to do to improve their quality of sleep?
The one thing I would say is to be regular with your sleep. And that is really relevant because nowadays what we do is that we get less sleep during the weekdays, but then on the weekend, because we feel we deserve it, we go to bed really late and then we wake up late. And so, if you're doing that, it's called social jet lag, which is akin to taking a flight and going 3 hours across to the West Coast while you're living on the East Coast, and so that's the kind of circadian dysrhythmia it produces, and it has a lot of detrimental cardiovascular and metabolic effects. So that is what I would say: regularity in your sleep-wake cycle.
Excellent. Dr. Singh, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today on the All Me podcast.
Thank you for giving me a platform to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And, as you guys listen and continue, we love growing our podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes. Be sure to download our podcast, whether you follow us on iTunes, on Spotify. Also check us out at taylorhooton.org. Lots of great things coming throughout the year 2020 and all throughout this year in regards to our education programs. A lot of education we'll be doing on our podcast. Hope you guys have a great day.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.